What could be more fitting to record on a hot summer day than Guns of the Arctic? Guns of the Arctic is what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, hunting, all the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. So, you guys may know if you pay attention to the podcast rather thoroughly that I was doing the podcast for years trying to make it financially viable, meaning that it would be a livable income, somewhere close to a median individual income in the U.S. It was not. I dug into savings for years, cashed out retirement, cashed out Bitcoin. It's all good. But recently, to build up some savings again, I took a job as pro gunfighting, private security contracting, carrying a gun for money, whatever you want to call that. So there's a name for that, I guess, mercenary. But so that's what I'm doing now. One of the things is that you have to have a legit amount of experience, background experience, to do our job, which means I get to hang out with some pretty cool cats, some pretty cool people. One of the guys that I was blessed to work with yesterday on an 8 or 9 hour shift, I have to do the math, but it was quite a long time to talk, and we didn't talk about this the whole time, but I was blessed to find out that first and foremost, he believed in Jesus Christ, and that he was a survivalist, a prepper, whatever you want to call that. He was into that, and doing what we do, you might imagine, although you might be surprised, not everybody is that into guns. They just make their living that way. But he was very much into guns and into hunting, and at least in his younger days. And he had a pretty interesting geographical thing in his background. He moved to the very northern part of Alaska, well north of the Arctic Circle, when he was 10 years old. And he lived there. He grew up there, well north of the Arctic Circle. And he was a sworn law enforcement officer. He was law enforcement up there in the Arctic, in a place so remote there were no roads going there. The only way to get there was to fly. Or he said a barge came once or twice a year. I forget what he said. They would have a barge with supplies, but it wasn't like a barge for people. It was a barge for like big, heavy supplies. As he said, the way to get there was to fly. Sometimes in the winter you could drive over the ice, but he said it was pretty treacherous. And I don't want to give away exactly what he did or exactly where he lived, but it was, I looked it up geographically, it is far, far north. Again, well north of the Arctic Circle. So Guns of the Arctic, that's what we are going to talk about. I got on the subject and talked about this with him for a long time. Not the entire 8 hour shift, but a lot we talked about, Guns of the Arctic. So I thought, that'd be a good idea for an episode. So that's what we talked about. So with that, in that introduction, I'm going to put in my bio, and then we'll get into the main topic. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as a instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the LAPD, both full-time as a sworn police officer and in some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a FBI firearms instructor, still am an FBI firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also NRA certified and some other 3-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. by God's grace, he got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because he chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast, and elk and bear and wolf, and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Enough about me, guys. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. Let's get into today's topic. You know what? Just before I get into the main body of this, my wife just got back from the city, and she got me Dutch Brothers. Now, you East Coasters may not know about Dutch Brothers, but I'm usually not big on a fancy city cup of coffee because I don't think it's worth the money. And I don't drink caffeine. As a general rule, I drink decaf. I just like the flavor of it. But that's a good wife. Come back on a hot summer day with an iced coffee. She went to the big city. Big city is probably it's 16,000 and something people per the internet. But if you don't know, we live as neo-nomads, off-grid, semi-off-grid, and she wanted to go into the city to do laundry. You know how girls are about their clothes and their hygiene. And she came back with an iced coffee. I'm a blessed man. Anyway, let's get into this. Guns of the Arctic. Alright, how cold are we talking? We're talking about whale up north on the Arctic Circle, the North Slope, and we're talking about Alaska. And it says here, minus 56 degrees, coldest at the airport. It also says in another place, minus 58 degrees. And I was like, that's cold. And then I saw Celsius, minus 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And he mentioned minus 70 below. And I just wanted to double check that. And that, I guess, in fact, is a thing. That's chilly. Now, I lived in Alaska, but I purposely avoided the Arctic Circle portion of Alaska. I lived in the southeast rainforests of Alaska. Very, very different. Not even close. I mean, if you look at it on a map, very different geographically and climate-wise. This guy grew up and was a law enforcement officer in the Arctic Circle. And we're talking the American Arctic. The Canadian Arctic may have different guns because different laws and different availability and different import stuff. So I'm telling you what he told me from growing up there and doing a full career and retiring as a law enforcement officer from up there. Alright, and this is what he told me. Let's start off with calibers. He said the most common calibers. And he didn't have like a little clicker and like count every time he went in somebody's house to see what they had. But I'm, again, recounting what he told me. Most common caliber, 5.56. What? Crazy. That's not enough for Alaska. I'm telling you what he told me. 5.56, 270, 30-06, 7.62 by 39. He also said the SKS was fairly common, as were the AR-15 and AK-47. And those things really surprised me. And he described to me how they hunted. It's not the first time I've heard this, although first time I heard this in this exact location. But basically said they get into a group on snow machines, and we're talking the natives, and they drive up to herds of caribou and just fire into them. And whatever falls, falls. They pick up what's there, and whatever gets away, gets away. I'm not here to say that that's cool, or that's certainly probably not legal if you and I do it. I'm not here to argue whether that's malum prohibitum, malum in se, or both. I'm just telling you what he told me. But if you're doing that, if that's how you're hunting herds of caribou on snow machines, then that makes a little bit more sense, right? SKSs, AR-15s, and AK-47s. That AR-15s are pretty common, especially among the younger generation of the natives up there. He also mentioned really common, and we're talking like if we're talking traditional hunting rifles, he mentioned specifically the Rugers, the stainless steel Rugers, the M77s. The old Ruger M77 was actually the first centerfire rifle that I bought with my own money. Got stolen when I went in the Marine Corps out of my buddy's truck. I let him borrow it. But one of those stainless steel Ruger 77s, they still make the Hawkeye. But those are, and I think those are pretty common in Alaska as a whole. But those Ruger M77s, controlled round feed, which you know I'm big on. Stainless steel, which you know I'm big on. and some have iron sights, which I'm big on, but he mentioned those specifically. And for calibers, 270, 30-06, 308, and he mentioned specifically 243. A lot of people like the 243. And I want to get into a fundamental difference about, and this is not, and I've been a guide, and I'm not against sport hunting, but I hunt for meat. He mentioned specifically these people use their guns like tools to get meat. They're not concerned with the next cool, hot, whiz-bang caliber as a whole that's in a gun magazine that's going to give you 150 feet per second and, .01 better BC. They don't care. They're there to put meat on the table. I also mentioned specifically because I figured there would be a lot of Mosin Nagants up there because they're cheap. And he told me no. He told me they were not common up there. He said he had a buddy that had one, a law enforcement officer that had one. I think he said a buddy. I assumed a law enforcement officer, maybe not. He said he knew one guy that had one, but they were not super common up there. And his explanation as to why is they're heavy guns, which they are. And you got to remember, you're paying for your stuff to get flown in. And freight is, the cost of that is really expensive. Are you going to spend a bunch of money in shipping to ship a heavy rifle that's not really good, that's a cheap, heavy rifle? And when you put it like that, financially, does that make a lot of sense? Are you going to, I'm just making up a number, I don't know how much it costs. Are you going to spend $200 in freight to ship a Mosin Nagant and a Spam Cam full of ammo back in the day when they were $79? Are you going to spend that on a Ruger M77 that's, back I imagine in his heyday was $500, $600, $700. That was a much better rifle for hunting. Which, when he put it like that, that made a lot of sense. So he said did not see a lot of Mosin Nagants. The SKSs, he said, however, were common. And I do believe those are pretty common in Canada as well. He did also mention the Mini 14s. The Mini 14s, he said, pretty common. He also asked what about other bolt actions. Again, he mentioned the Ruger specifically by name, the M77 or the 77. But he also said the Remington 700 Winchester Model 70, which is no surprise there. For shotguns, he mentioned shotguns. He said, waterfowl hunting, and, there's a ton of waterfowl up there on the north slope. He said waterfowl hunting was a big part. Waterfowl and ptarmigan was a big thing up there. And as you might expect, no surprise, 870 and 500. Which, that's no surprise. I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. And those are guns that really stand up to really harsh environments. He said, though, the most common gun probably up there, make and model, he said probably the most common gun up there was a Ruger 1022. 1022, way up there in Alaska, you got to have at least a 375 H&H. People would have you believe that, right? Gun magazines and try to sell you stuff to get you to buy a brand new gun when you go to Alaska. However, that's what he said. He said 1022, probably one of the most common guns, and that makes sense if you think about it, again, from a tool to use to get food on the table. Although probably not legal, a Ruger 1022 is perfectly capable of taking waterfowl, ducks, and geese. And if you're paying to fly the ammo in, right, that's one of the main advantages of a rimfire, of a 22 long rifle. The ammunition is going to cost a lot less to ship, let's say, 10,000 rounds of that than 10,000 rounds of 12 gauge. So that makes sense from a financial, practical standpoint. If you're trying to hunt small game, the 22, it makes sense. And he said that was probably the most common gun up there. Makes a lot of sense. Now he didn't mention handguns, so I asked him about handguns, and he said not really. And he told me some pretty crazy stories about polar bears. Had some run-ins with him himself in his time up there, and he mentioned some other pretty grisly stories about polar bear, which I'm not going to recount here. Definitely not PG, but some gruesome stuff about polar bears. And what he said, even a 44 mag is not great for polar bear. He said you really want a long gun, and it was not uncommon for people to just walk around downtown with their long gun slung on their back. And he said one of the things that, you could tell when like tourists were in town, bird watchers or whatever, because they would be calling about people walking down Main Street with guns. And he's like, yeah, that's a thing. But, and I agree, he said pretty much anything, like a 308 is much, much better, like any center fire common rifle, not a 2556 obviously, but Like a 308 versus a 44 mag. A 44 mag is a powerhouse in a handgun, not compared to a 308 or a 30-06 for that matter. So if you're going out in an area you might encounter a polar bear, you're probably going to bring a rifle. And that's what he said. You might see a handgunner here or there, but they're not common as a whole. And I know what you're thinking, like the 454 Casull, you got to have that for bear. But remember, you have to get the ammo. And he's like, you get ammo at the grocery store. Remember, it's a tiny place up in the middle of nowhere. Common calibers. You'll notice a main theme throughout this whole thing, common calibers. I asked him specifically about like the 375 H&H. He said he knew his school teacher had one who was big into hunting. And that's about it. But like common calibers. You're probably not going to the grocery store and finding 454 Casull or 500 Smith & Wesson or anything else. So, although the marketing hype and everything would have you believe you need these giant wheel guns for like polar bear or bear defense, he said it wasn't really a thing. He said if you were messing with a polar bear, you took a rifle. And you can get mad at that if you want, but that guy grew up there and did a whole career as a law enforcement officer there, so it is what it is, not what you want it to be. I also wanted to touch on some other parts that I found interesting in our conversation. He said, really, and I'm sure there are exceptions to this, he's talking about as a whole, as a collective, right? He said, like, heirloom quality guns, not really a thing. He said, you know, especially with the large native population there, they didn't really maintain their stuff. They used it, they left it outside, or in a mud room. Forget what he called it. There was a specific, like, native name they had for, like, what we would call a mud room. That breaks up the cold Arctic air and the inside air like a middle room. So that's where the guns stayed, and they were rusty and nasty. And he said, as I know, that stainless doesn't mean they don't rust, which I totally understand. But he told me, like, heirloom quality, not really a thing there. It's a throwaway kind of society. They get a bunch of money pumped in from the oil. They buy stuff, they use it. From their snow machines to their guns. When it breaks down, they get rid of it. So he said, like, fine heirloom quality guns, not really a thing. He didn't really mention any older guns. He said side-by-sides, like shotguns specifically, weren't a thing. Pumps and semi-autos, because, again, not really any heirloom quality stuff up there. And I'm not telling you that's good. I'm not telling you what you should do that, just like I'm not telling you should run out and mow down a herd of caribou with AR-15s. I'm just telling you what he said. He says a throwaway society. They don't really maintain their stuff. They use it as a tool to put food on the table. They don't really maintain it. They buy new stuff when their old stuff's worn out. A throwaway society, I think, specifically is what he said. And again, I found that interesting. So a quick recap, he said common calibers, 5.56, 270, 0.6, 7.62 by 39, 308 and 243. Again, common calibers. He mentioned shotgun rounds and 22 long rifle. Again, should be no surprise there. But a lot of people think, you know, you got to have these crazy special rounds. You need a 7 SAUM or a 300 RUM or a 375 H&H or something for Alaska. But he said common calibers. Common calibers. And for guns, he mentioned specifically the Ruger 77s were common up there. Also Remington 700s, Winchester Model 70s. And SKSs, AR-15s with the younger generation, AK-47s. The Ruger 1022, specifically by name, he mentioned the Remington 870 and the Mossberg 500. And he said handguns. Like if you saw one, typical 940-45, he said you may see an old wheel gun here or there, but handgun's not a big thing up there. And if you think about it, what's one of the common things I've said about handguns? And I love handguns, and I just shot a handgun. I just literally came out from shooting handgun. Practice with handgun more than anything else. I make my living with a handgun on my hip. But handguns are to have because you can't have a rifle. They're not inherently effective. They're not inherently easy to shoot compared to long guns, rifles, or shotguns. And if you think about it, if you live in a place where it's completely socially acceptable to walk up and down Main Street with a rifle on your back or a shotgun, that takes away a big part of the why you would have a handgun. Also, I mentioned he was a law enforcement officer, and he said he ran the gambit as I did when I was a law enforcement officer. He said, actually he didn't. He said 40, he started out in the era with 40, as did I, and then moved to 9mm. And I ran the gambit 940 and 45. He said he could have carried a 45 if he had wanted to, but he didn't. He went from 40 to 9mm. I ran the whole gambit as a law enforcement officer, 9, 40, 45, although not in that order. Specifically, I went 40. Well, if you count the military, I was 9, 40, then 45, then 9mm. But he mentioned, the common calibers for his law enforcement duties. He also mentioned specifically that the issues his department had with always trying to get some cool new gun. Like he mentioned, I'm not going to mention the model by name, but a certain new trendy assault rifle type gun, and they could get full auto, and they did get full auto. And it's supposed to be the new hot thing. And he said it didn't work up there in the cold. He said it was too cold, like minus 70 degrees, stuff up there didn't work. And he said, it did work. Colt AR-15 or M16. You know why? Because they were tested for Arctic conditions. As much as people want to crap on the AR-15 for not being reliable, he said, the Colt AR-15, M4s, M16s, whatever, they were tested for Arctic conditions. And they worked in those conditions. The new hot rifle that they tried out in full auto, it didn't work. It didn't work out for them. It didn't work in those cold conditions. And he also mentioned the Smith & Wesson M&P, said it was fine too. And obviously I've been saying this for a long time. When people ask me what's my number one recommendation for an AR, it's if it's a budget recommendation, it's a Smith & Wesson M&P. If it's just I want one really good AR-15 M4 type thing, it's a Colt LE6920, right? Because they work. There's been decades and decades of R&D that have gone into those, from Arctic to tropical to deserts, right? They're not the greatest gun, they're not the most reliable gun, but they are fairly reliable, especially the Colt, like LE6920 or similar models that have actually had all that testing and R&D, not the next new experimental model, or not the cheap budget put-together gun with a bunch of different parts, with a bunch of different tolerances stacked together, but like an actual gun like that has all that testing and R&D, which is basically the same thing as the military, but in semi-auto instead of full auto or 3-round burst. Yeah, makes sense. Also, he mentioned his love for the AK because they just work. And especially in that kind of environment, I can totally see that. I mean, the Russians are a cold weather people in general. It makes sense that the gun that they designed works well in the Arctic environment. Anyway, guys, with that, we'll start wrapping up this episode, Guns of the Arctic. I hope that you liked it. I hope that you enjoyed it, found it informative, even if you don't agree with it. Now, in wrapping up here, we touched on something that I would like to go back to. We talked about the throwaway culture and how they didn't take care of their guns and they just kind of left them in their intermediate room, didn't really do any upkeep on them, take care of them. And that's the extreme on one end. I don't advocate that. I don't advocate just not taking care of something when a little bit of maintenance will go a long way in the longevity of a firearm. But here's the thing. I think in the lower 48 and a lot of places, this gun culture, we've gone too much the other way. And I dare say some men even idolize guns. They put them up on a pedestal as not tools, as something else. And I'm not talking about like guns as art, because then the gun is obviously art. I'm not talking about people that collect guns for like historical purposes. But guns are tools. Let's not forget that they're meant to be used. For example, if you are a firearms instructor or in a class or something, you see somebody that's really babying a gun, you might want to consider having them hold that gun out and dropping it on the ground. Yeah. And if they're not willing to do that, either they have the wrong gun for the class, because you're there to learn practical riflemanship, pistol craft, shotgun, whatever. You're learning to use that gun as a tool to be effective, not to Barbie it. It's not a Barbie doll, it's a gun. Some little girls might treat their Barbie dolls more aggressively than some men treat their guns. If they're not willing to drop that gun on the ground, either it's the wrong gun for the class, or they don't have the right mindset for using that gun as a tool. The gun is a tool. That's why it exists. It is a tool, and this is survival guns for putting food on the table or for defending one's life or somebody else's life from the threat of death or serious bodily injury. It's why that thing exists. Don't treat it like garbage, but don't idolize it either. Don't put it up on a pedestal. Don't be afraid to use it. You can use something without abusing it. And I think that kind of finding that balance is important. If you actually do live or have lived up there above the Arctic Circle, and you've got some additional guns to add, or it was different in your area, then write in, let us know, leave a comment below the podcast, or if you're listening to this on Spotify, there's a thing to interact there. Anyway, with that, your tactical tip of the day. Guns of the Arctic. Today's tactical tip is not going to be on the Arctic because a lot of you people probably don't live in minus 70 degrees, I hope. But when you're out shooting in the heat, as this is being recorded in the summer, and it'll probably come out sometime when it's warm out, God willing, the first time at least, neck gaiters. Dip them in water. They're like a little mini personal air conditioner. They work the same way your sweat does. When stuff evaporates, it lowers the temperature. You get a neck gaiter, you dunk it in water, put it on your neck. Also can help the back of your neck from getting sunburn, which is often one of the most sunburned parts. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day, your tactical verse of the day. Whatever man of the children of Israel, or the stranger who dwells among you, who hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.